Despite having significant resources of oil, gas, and the very minerals that we need to build clean energy technology, Africa is an energy paradox. 75% of the world's population that lack access to energy live on the continent. That's 600 million people. Yet Africa is also the fastest growing continent in the world. In 25 years, 1 out of every 4 people on the planet will live in Africa. When combined with rapidly rising incomes and fast urbanization, this is going to put immense pressure on Africa's energy. I'm joined here by Andrew Herscowitz. Andy is the executive director of the Overseas Development Institute, and in a former life, he was the founding head of Power Africa, the US government's initiative to double energy access on the continent. Andy, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Andy, for my first question, I want to reflect on the fact that although Africa's energy supply has increased quite significantly in the last 20 years, as we see on this graph, the population without electricity in Africa has actually gone up a little bit. And this is really owing to the rate of population growth, as we see from 2000 to 2021. Now, I'm curious, given your decade of experience working on the energy sector, what's your outlook on whether we will be able to meet future demand and whether we will be able to get more generation and transmission capacity online as population growth actually picks up?
Yeah, well, there's already plenty of demand right now in Africa. It's a supply issue, but it's not just supply. And when we launched Power Africa, what we said was we're going to increase the number of megawatts of electricity in the African continent. And everyone got excited and everyone was building new power projects. But we kind of lost focus on the fact that you actually have to get the electricity to people and to businesses. So if you don't have the transmission and distribution infrastructure, you're not going to solve the issue. And when 1 year into Power Africa, this was back in around 2014, we said, all right, we have this big goal related to power generation, but what about, back then we would say 700 million people who didn't have access to electricity. What about all those people who live far away from the grid? And in Africa, in many of the countries, the population density is very low. And so people thought, well, we're going to have distributed power generation, and you're going to have, little mini grids everywhere, and it's going to just bring people in the rural areas electricity. That's not happening, and we can talk a little bit about that, why. I actually feel really good about the direction that we're headed because we've been working on this, at least with Power Africa has been working on it for over a decade now. We've learned a tremendous amount. Everybody who we've worked with has learned a tremendous amount. Power Africa was a partnership of over 170 governments, private sector entities. So now we're at this really great place where the technology prices have come down and people know what the problems are. The biggest issue is whether there's the money to move forward. When Power Africa was at its height, it was getting $300 million a year. The US government cut that down to about $70 million. Right at the time we were seeing what the opportunity was to really make a huge difference. We've got to get that number back up. We're not talking about hundreds of billions of dollars that need to be spent to kind of grease the wheels to get deals across the finish line, but a few billion dollars can make a massive difference to the fastest growing continent in the world.
So one of the things I thought was interesting is you started talking about the capital that's required. I've been thinking a lot about the renewable energy landscape, and Power Africa financed a significant amount of the renewable energy projects, solar, wind, that we see on the continent. Now, Africa has a significant share of the critical minerals that we need for the clean energy transition. If I look at this graph, platinum is a core part of the electric vehicle transition, manganese, chrome, cobalt. We see that Africa has between half and 80% of supply. But Africa has also only received about 2.4% of the investment in renewable energy in the last decade, meaning it's going to be very difficult to meet the scale of demand that we have in front of us. Do you see that changing in terms of investment in renewable energy on the continent? And what renewable energy technologies are you most excited about?
Yeah. So let's back up to COP when there was this announcement that we're going to try to triple renewable energy by 2030. I was wholly unimpressed with that announcement because that's just talking about the direction where the market is headed. And you look at markets all over the world, you look at the number of battery factories that are now moving forward in the United States, for example, compared to just a couple of years ago. The market's headed in that direction. But the problem is, it's the markets in Africa, certain countries which have been left behind. partly because investors won't go there, but partly for a variety of issues. I think sometimes the tools that are being offered aren't the appropriate ones. I see three key constraints to investment in the power sector in Africa. One is currency, right? You're looking at countries whose currencies have depreciated close to 100% against the dollar in the last 20 years. Yet the development finance institutions, the multilateral development banks, continue to lend for infrastructure projects in these countries in US dollars. What does that mean? The whole goal is to provide inexpensive, sustainable electricity in these countries. But if you're going to have to keep raising the rate, the electricity rate in the country in order to pay off this debt, it just makes the problem worse. So the banks themselves, the public institutions, they need to do more to take on that currency risk if we want to see sustainable development. Number two is capacity. And when I say capacity, I'm talking about two things. Either countries themselves have never done a solar project before, so they don't have people the experience of doing the tendering, or they just don't simply have enough people. Some of the countries are smaller and they don't have enough people to do it. So one of the things that donor countries can do is help them with that capacity. When we were running Power Africa, even South Africa, which is an upper middle income country, had 20 power projects that were stuck, renewable projects that were stuck. We put 20 advisors into the agency that was responsible for that power procurement for just a period of a few months. Lawyers, financial people, and they cleared up all that backlog and all of those projects move forward. As countries do more and more, they're gonna be able to scale it at a much more rapid rate. And the third thing is political will. And this is one of the biggest constraints that I've seen in Africa. Either you don't have a strong head of state that tells all the ministers to get aligned and saying this is what we're going to do. There's lack of certainty. You know, who wants to invest in a country when you know there's going to be an election in 6 months or a year, and there's this danger that someone's going to suddenly pull the rug out from under you. And so we also have to make sure that there's predictability in the market. We know what the issues are, and we can solve them, but you look at the trajectory that globally, these technologies are there. It's just a question. You don't have to get fancy. You don't have to be doing hydrogen. Okay, everyone's talking about the new bright shiny object. You still haven't scaled solar power. You still haven't scaled wind power. And one of the biggest constraints that I see is lack of transmission infrastructure that lets them take advantage of that.
You made a really interesting point too there, is I'm thinking about the way renewable energy investment has been concentrated. If we look at 75% of that renewable energy investment, it's crowded into about 5 countries: Egypt, Morocco, Kenya, South Africa. These countries actually have domestic capital markets, but much of the continent does not. Now, if I look at the challenges in the last 3 or 4 years, and we can circle back to this a bit later, is debt is a growing challenge. We've had 8 countries default since the pandemic, and debt is skyrocketing. So even if you were to make local currency denominated loans, or you were to cover some of that risk, there's a shrinking amount of fiscal capacity to absorb these loans. So how do we ensure that we're building the energy sector even though there's larger macroeconomic challenges?
So the key is getting deals across the finish line, that first deal. If you look at what happened, IFC had a great program called Scaling Solar. That idea was to create a package for a government who's never done solar before and come in, standard agreements and all of these things. Power Africa supported that in Zambia, and you saw really low solar prices come from that. Then they went to Senegal, but the difference between Senegal and Zambia is Senegal had already done one small solar project and demonstrated to the global markets that they could do a procurement, that they could move it forward. So then when it came time to do a competitive procurement like that with support from Scaling Solar, the bids came in from everywhere because it was this predictable market. So as the market becomes more predictable, and as they've demonstrated they can do a project, sort of the risk is viewed as being lower and lower, which increases competition, which drives down the cost. So really what all the donors and the public institutions need to do is help countries get those first deals across the finish line. And it doesn't have to be a competitive tender. In fact, I've argued with the World Bank and others for small markets, let them do a 10 megawatt solar project, a 20 megawatt wind project where they're getting lots of technical assistance. You know, if a 10 megawatt or 20 megawatt wind or solar project is not going to bankrupt a country if the prices are a little high, but what you do is you demonstrate to international markets that these deals can move forward so that when you design the competitive tenders, the money will flow in, you'll have more competition, and you'll see the success like you've seen in a country like Senegal.
Yeah, that's a really, the scalability of these energy solutions is really critical. Now, we were both at COP. I really enjoyed seeing you there. And one of the things that came up over and over again was the idea of energy justice. So the biggest threat to our global energy transition is the friction between developed and developing countries. And to that extent, I've been thinking a lot about gas lately. Africa, if we think about global gas discoveries, it has had 40% of gas discoveries in the last decade. And in a way, gas is cleaner than coal. So if we look at this graph over the last 40 years, I mean, the more we look, the more gas we find. It's cleaner than coal. Emissions are about half of coal. Yet, when I look at a country like Mozambique, which energy access rate sits at about 40%, but has the third biggest gas reserves, but we're exporting all of that gas to Europe. In fact, Mozambique only uses about 1% of the gas it produces. I'm wondering about the viability, in your opinion, to actually scale up gas for consumption on the continent, as opposed to just exporting it.
Yeah, look, gas, and I wrote a blog during COP, which I'm sure raised quite a few eyebrows. I launched it right during COP, where I said the energy transition is more like a Toyota Prius than it is an EV. And I would love to see a world where we don't need gas or non-renewable energy. The reality is that we're not there yet. And you can't do energy development at the expense of economic development. We don't do it in our own country, so there's a tremendous amount of hypocrisy there. That being said, when I've sat on panels with people from the gas industry who said, you're always going to need gas, I was like, that's actually not true. In fact, there are such rich renewable baseload energy sources in Africa that if you could really develop the cross-border transmission infrastructure in the countries, you could have a scenario where you paint the Kalahari Desert in Botswana and Namibia with solar panels, which is intermittent, but you have transmission lines that go up into Mozambique and Zimbabwe, which have these huge hydro potential, which serves as the backup battery. And you have transmission lines going into Mozambique so that gas can also be used for baseload energy. I mean, everyone wants to do batteries, but batteries still tend to be expensive. But with existing commercialized technologies, with the proper trading, the proper transmission infrastructure, you could have a completely renewable environment in Africa right now. But the reality is there hasn't been the political will, and there hasn't been the money going forward to help them do that. So the same people who are saying, we want South Africa to retire its coal, and you can't do gas and go all renewable, and we're going to commit all of this money. Okay, how much money has been committed to JET-P in just South Africa alone? If you took $7 billion and actually put it into transmission infrastructure throughout the continent, imagine what you could accomplish with just naturally through market forces by promoting the use of renewable energy. Instead, everyone tries to make these big announcements for things that don't really get anywhere, when you could actually, there are solutions that we know exist.
So I'm with you on the point that gas is a good transition source of energy. Do you think then that it's actually worth the investment? I mean, developing the infrastructure for gas investment is long-term and it's extremely expensive. Yeah. Should we be doing that?
So I don't buy into the stranded asset argument. Usually the life of a gas power generation plant is going to be about 20 years. And I think 20 years is probably about the right timeline right now that you would need to do what we need to do to build all the other infrastructure and create the ecosystem. I'm actually quite optimistic that we're going to achieve climate goals. I think gas is going to play a role, not only just for power generation, but if you think about it also for cooking. I mean, 3 billion people in the world are still chopping down trees, using charcoal, using biomass for cooking. If you just had gas even just for cooking, that would have a significant positive impact. And the reason that you can't just transition to small solar, like I've heard people with the solar home system companies saying, oh, well, you've got a solar home system and you're just fine if you're living in a rural area. I'm sorry, but a small solar home system usually has like maybe 50, 70, 80 watts. You need 700 watts to boil a liter of water. Okay, no one can afford a 700-watt panel in those rural areas, so they're going to go ahead and they're going to keep burning charcoal and biomass. But if you can get LPG or other types of cooking fuels there, that'll give people sort of what would be a modern energy household. Because people, it's not just about electricity and charging your mobile phone. It's about cooling, it's about heating, it's about cooking. And as soon as people have access to modern energy services, that helps their incomes increase, which then gives time for the newer technologies to become, the cost curves to come down, and then you meet nicely in the middle. And I'm guessing that's probably a 15 to 25 year period where that happens.
I want to switch also to nuclear power. People called COP28 the COP of nuclear power, which a lot of people said they couldn't have dreamed of 5 years ago. Jennifer Granholm came out and said, you know, we need to triple our global nuclear capacity. Africa, a lot of African countries have been signing cooperation agreements to advance their nuclear efforts. Obviously, Egypt is building a nuclear plant now, but Burkina Faso, Ethiopia, Kenya, they've signed cooperation agreements with nuclear. Nuclear is a really good source of baseload power. I think 20% of the US's power comes from the nuclear sector. Do you think nuclear power is viable in Africa?
Absolutely, but not now. This is a thing. Another bright, shiny object, hydrogen, nuclear, battery storage. We're gonna do all these things. Focus on the technologies that have existed for 20 years that just haven't scaled yet in Africa, and that gives time for the cost curves to come down for those technologies. It gives time for incomes to rise. It's the fastest growing continent in the world. And if you have a middle class that can afford nuclear power 15, 20 years from now, don't make Africa the guinea pig for small modular nuclear. Let other countries bring down that cost curve so that when it's ready, people can afford it. But that's why I say that when you think about the energy transition, you have to think about it in stages. It's not a flipping the switch. It's not saying suddenly no gas, no fossil fuels, and we're going to make this switch right now. And all of a sudden, all of these technologies that haven't become commercially viable at scale in the rest of the world, we expect Africa to do that now. Give it a 20-year period and continue to raise incomes, use existing technologies, let the cost curves for the newer technologies to come down, including nuclear, and we're going to achieve our climate ambitions.
So really aiming for that diversified energy basket over time.
It's like the blog that I wrote. I said we're a hybrid vehicle. The climate transition is the Toyota Prius was introduced in 1996. Okay, that's almost 30 years ago. It's only now that we're seeing EVs start to scale, right? We need time. You still need a little bit of gas.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I rented a Tesla for the first time about 6 months ago,
Right.
and I was driving in the mountains in Virginia, and then I realized the Tesla was going to die, and the closest charging station was 45 minutes ago, and I swore off driving anything but a hybrid for the next 10
Right.
years. So again, I really value the time difference that it's going to take for Africa to roll out some of these technologies.
Right, and the market is headed in that direction anyway. I mean, there were people, 10 years ago who were saying that EVs are dead. There are people today who are saying that EVs are dead. I'm sorry, EVs are not dead. They're working out the kinks. They're going to start having EVs. I think there's 10 EVs coming out this year. They're going to have a third row seat so Americans can take them on vacation. They're going to be EVs with 500, 600, 700 mile ranges. I haven't bought an EV yet. I want to get one, but I'm kind of waiting for the technology to get to where it needs to be to meet my needs. Mm-hmm. But we're talking about like 20 to 30 years, in the whole history of humanity. We have to be patient. Market's going there.
Absolutely. I want to actually pivot now. You talked about transmission being this binding constraint, and McKinsey has estimated that it'll cost $400 billion by 2050 in Africa to get the transmission infrastructure that you need. And when the International Energy Agency actually modeled what a sustainable development scenario is, where we hit universal energy access, it's congruent with our energy, hitting universal energy access, they kind of put together this graph to say, you're going to need mini-grid, standalone, and grid. Yeah. But now, off-grid, in a way, is controversial. It's often, it can charge a phone, it can turn on a light. They did a survey of 39,000 people in 12 African countries, and a significant share of them found off-grid, infrastructure to be inadequate to meet their very basic needs, kind of how you were talking about what you need to boil a kettle of water. Right. In your experience, how important are off-grid solution or standalone systems? Should we be scaling up? Is that where we should be putting our resources?
So look. I was at a COP, I think it was the Paris COP, where they did the Paris Agreement, and I was in a room with a bunch of solar home system companies. I said to them, the work that you're doing is actually some of the most important work in here, and there's only like 50 of us in this room. And the reason it's so important is What those companies were doing was they weren't just providing electricity, they were also figuring out how many electrons they could squeeze out of a small solar panel to give people products that they needed, whether it was an electric razor, cell phone charging. You know, it forced energy efficiency to create televisions that ran on 12 watts, right? So this was really, really important, and it was investment and research that's going to benefit everyone who's on the grid as well. Not only that, they were having they had data about energy usage about all their customers in rural areas, so that as utilities eventually go out to these areas, if they do there, they have an idea of how they can scale in those areas, who can pay, how much they're able to pay, where they should go first. There's a tremendous amount of benefit just from having those technologies. Now, ultimately, is solar the answer to have someone live a modern energy lifestyle? Pure solar is not. Solar with batteries, maybe to some degree, but that tends to be expensive as well. One of the things, I had this aha moment, like I hated when people would talk about, and they still do it, they say, we're gonna have distributed renewable energy and it's gonna be like the cell phone and we're gonna leapfrog, you know, centralized systems. Okay, that has not borne out to be true, and I could have told you that 10 years ago that wouldn't become true. Because ultimately, you still need to run a wire to a household. I wrote a blog about this, and there have been a couple companies that have actually started about this, saying the key is, you know, you need to have mini grids that are charging batteries, where batteries become a commodity, where someone can take that, put it in an electric motorcycle, drive home, take that battery out, plug it in, watch TV. It's going to be these types of things that we haven't even thought of that are going to be the future of electricity in Africa.
I get really excited about innovation because personally I think it's something that the US is very good at. Capitalism is great. We do R&D really phenomenally, and I would love to see US R&D kind of start to meet the need for these energy solutions that we need abroad.
Well, no, but on that note, like people that criticize the IRA and saying the US is doing industrial policy and it's only going to benefit the US. And I say, are you kidding me? I go, everyone in the world is going to benefit from the cost curves coming down from US investments in these technologies. Let the US take the hits on these. A lot of these companies are going to fail, but a lot of them are going to succeed, and we don't know which ones are. But we're going to bring down the cost curves so that other countries can take advantage of the new technologies.
Absolutely. Before I move to my last question, I mean, I think this is something that my team at CSIS has been thinking a lot about, is if we think about what US global climate leadership looks like, a lot of it will be taking this technology, getting it cost competitive and deploying it, because we can't be the only one to be reducing our emissions at home. We need to ensure that the world moves with us. Now, my last question comes back to who is going to pay for this, right? So debt has skyrocketed over the last 11 years. When I look at this graph, the blue line was actually debt in 2011, and our orange line is debt like in 2021. The average debt to GDP ratio has increased from 30% to 66%. Which means countries simply don't have the fiscal capacity to pay for this, as we were talking earlier. Now, this has left a big void in energy, in who's going to pay for this energy, because governments really cannot. So a couple questions to wrap up here is, first of all, what role do multilateral development banks play in this? You talked earlier about currency and reducing either dollar-denominated debt. I mean, we were both living in South Africa. When I arrived, it was 10 to $1. During COVID, it had hit 20 to $1, and it still sits just below 20. So what role do they play, and what role does Power Africa play, one? And two is, what does it take to bring the private sector to the table? You talked about kind of, we need a project to be able to show that one project works and then we get more. But what legal and regulatory reforms do we need to make it a more lucrative environment for the private sector, who of course is seeking a commercial return?
Yeah. Well, let's start with the fact that development finance, the public development finance architecture is broken. It's not designed to solve this problem, and everybody likes to talk about it, but they're not doing anything about it, right? And what I mean by that is every single one of the development finance institutions and MDBs basically design financing to have to earn a return. I'm sorry, but these are public development agencies. But the way that they were structured was that they're going to borrow money from capital markets and get to 100% capital preservation plus a few percentage points. Okay? That's the wrong model. They're not banks. They're development institutions that just happen to use financing as a tool. The reason I say that is, on the one hand, you've got the development finance institutions providing financing. Then you've got the aid institutions like USAID who just give money away, billions of dollars a year, and there's no expectation that there's going to be a return on that. There's this massive gap between the two. If you shifted some of those resources, more of those resources from the traditional aid agencies, gave them to development finance institutions, saying, instead of having to earn back 100 cents on the dollar, you could design a portfolio where you only need to earn back 90 cents on the dollar, and we're going to use that aid money to make up the difference. They could bring the private sector to the table. They could do financing that's way more sustainable at cost, particularly for infrastructure. And it could leverage a tremendous amount of money. So instead of thinking of that 10 cents that you're losing because you're using aid money, think of that as you're taking 10 cents and you're leveraging it into another 90 cents of private sector capital or financing that will get repaid. That's how you're going to get from the millions to the billions and the billions to trillions. But the shareholders of all these institutions and all the members of the, the stakeholders in the US and the Congress, they need to understand that we can get there. It doesn't cost hundreds of billions of dollars. It doesn't cost $400 billion. It literally costs maybe a few extra $1 billion a year to get development finance right.
And the private sector?
Well, that's the private sector. I mean, this is what the DFIs work with the private sector. The MDBs tend to work with public institutions. But either way, if you help the private sector say, we're going to take on the first $10 million of currency risk on this project in Nigeria, that's going to help them meet the numbers that they need to justify to their shareholders to make the investment in Nigeria instead of in Mexico City or in Chicago.
It really is utilizing capital more efficiently. I mean, we talk a lot about, fiscal leakage, but we actually do a lot of it in the aid and energy space abroad, is not using these resources efficiently. So personally, I'm a little bit more hopeful that I arrived. It's a hard topic when we come to the African continent, energy, poverty. It is a very gloom and doom narrative. But I think, I walk away realizing that if we're willing to be a little bit more patient with Africa's energy transition than we are in other places, that there's a lot of potential to actually meet future demand. Yeah. And I think what walks away, we're both sitting in Washington, but have spent time in Africa, is this really presents a very unique opportunity also to build U.S.-Africa commercial diplomacy away from an aid-based model to a more private sector commercial dynamic. Andy, thank you so much for joining us. I cannot think of someone better to speak to a lot of these challenges. It's been such a pleasure.
Thank you.